Welcome back, young scholars. In this video we will continue with our exploration of Western Europe during the Middle Ages, sometimes referred to as the Dark Ages. So after watching this video, you should be able to answer these two big questions. What are the cultural continuities and changes in Western Europe in the Middle Ages? And then how is order maintained in a feudal society? So what are those cultural continuities and changes in Western Europe during the Middle Ages? Well, one of the major continuities is the continuation of Christianity as the predominant faith. So the Catholic Church, led by the Pope, really fills that political power vacuum or void that came about as a result of the collapse of the Roman Empire and as a result of the kind of collapse of centralized authority across Western Europe. So just how powerful was the church? Well, one example that we have comes from the area of art. So in the Middle Ages, the art that was produced very typically is of a subject that deals with Christianity. So 95% of the art that's produced during this period, that's just a guess, oftentimes deals with Christian subjects. Now, the art also tends to be relatively bad. You can see here a Madonna image showing Mary and the baby Jesus, and you can see that Mary is kind of disproportionate. Jesus, who looks not like a baby but like a young kid. You can see it's very two-dimensional. It's a very flat kind of image and not very realistic. And we can compare that with a Renaissance piece that's of the exact same subject. Here we have, again, a Madonna, the Mary, a baby Jesus. It's very three-dimensional. It's very realistic looking. And so why is that? Well, one of the reasons that Middle Age art is so bad is because Middle Ages, the church forbid artists from making paintings that were considered too beautiful out of a fear that people would worship the image rather than worship the values that were represented by the people in that particular image. Another important cultural change during this period was crusades that took place. There were a series of Christian military expeditions that took place from 1095 to 1291. They really began as a result of the Byzantine Emperor Alexios felt threatened by the spread of Islam. And so the Byzantine Emperor basically asked for help from Pope Urban II. So Pope Urban II calls upon all the Christians of Western Europe to retake the Holy Land of Jerusalem from the Muslims. Now, in the process, this also would take some of the pressure off of the Byzantines in Constantinople right here, as we see the Seljuk Turks beginning to expand, push Islam into the Anatolian Peninsula. So here's what Pope Urban II called for. All who die by the way, whether by land or by sea or in battle against the pagans, shall have immediate remission of sins. So basically, anyone who went on these crusades would ultimately be forgiven of any sins, even if in the process they had to kill. And so therefore, the consequence of this is these became very bloody battles and very bloody struggles between Christians and Muslims. And so the Pope is essentially promising to these crusaders forgiveness for their sins. This is known as an indulgence. And many people who critique the crusade say, well, this basically just gave them the go-ahead to engage in all kinds of heinous, atrocious acts and be absolved for their sins, and in doing so. But the ultimate effect of this is that the Crusades led to centuries of mistrust between Christians and Muslims. This also led to centuries of mistrust between Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox Christians, because during the Fourth Crusade, instead of attacking the Holy Land to regain the Holy Land, the Crusaders actually went to Constantinople and attacked the city of Constantinople, laid siege to it, and ultimately, came back to Europe with some spoils of that attack, these being the 4 horses that are in St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice that used to belong on the Hippodrome in Constantinople. So ultimately, the Crusades are going to fail. They fail to regain the Holy Land. And so from that perspective, they don't have lasting significance in terms of leading to a great cultural transformation in the Middle East. But they do have the big impact because the Crusaders are going to return to Europe, and they're going to have this increased desire for Asian goods, right? They'd been exposed to all of these cultural elements of the Middle East and South Asia and Southeast Asia as a result of their experiences on these crusades. And this is going to increase demand for trade, which is going to be very important because Europeans are increasingly going to be looking for routes to Asia. And that is going to lead to increased European exploration, which is going to eventually become important in the next period. So how is order maintained in a feudal society? So if we stop and think about it, with the sort of political breakdown of authority in Western Europe, with the collapse of the Roman Empire, we have really this void that has come into existence. And we have increasingly decentralized rule. So anyone who's ever played with the Castle Lego set probably understands a little bit about feudalism. The definition for feudalism is it's a social system that's made up of a series of reciprocal relationships. So when ultimately there's no central authority to provide protection to people and to provide for their basic needs, instead people turn to this series of reciprocal relationships. And this is kind of the default condition, if you will, for human societies. So at the top of the feudal pyramid, we have the king, the queen, and the royal family. Below them, we have these nobles, which can include a very complex system of dukes, counts, earls, barons. Below the nobles, we have the knights. Below the knights, we have the serfs or the peasants. There wasn't actually a significant amount of slavery during the Middle Ages in Europe. They relied more on serfdom as a form of coerced labor. Every one of these different groups had these different relationships, these reciprocal relationships. The peasants would have relationships with the nobles. So here's what the king would do. The king would give to the nobles land, which is known as a fief. So the kings give land fiefs to nobles. The nobles then in turn would give a smaller portion of that fief to their knights. They would also give to their knights food, armor, weapons, horses. The nobles would also allow for the serfs or peasants to work the rest of that fief. They would give them a small area to farm. They would provide protections to the serfs. And they would also allow the serfs to keep a small portion of their crops. Now, in return, the nobles would give to the king their loyalty, and they would also offer protection in the event that there was an attack on their kingdom. The knights then would provide to the nobles loyalty and protection as well in the event of an attack. And then finally, the serfs would give to the nobles their labor. They would also have to pay taxes to the noble lord in the form of crops. And so that's how society organized itself. So feudalism is a way to understand how society would organize itself in order to satisfy the two most basic needs, which is food, the production of food, and also protection in a society where there's no real centralized order. We're going to see similar feudal societies form in other places where there is a lack of centralized authority, like Japan, for example. Now, in terms of the economic characteristics of the Middle Ages, one of the unique things that formed were these guilds, these association of craftsmen who controlled the price, the quantity, and the quality of goods that were produced. So, for example, these various towns or villages would have shoemakers, and they would be responsible for making shoes. And so they essentially decided, all right, how many shoes should we produce? What quality should the shoes be? And what price should we sell them at? And so there was a lot of control by these guilds over the production and allocation of goods. And this is a real precursor to our modern day labor union, right? These association of people who all have these skills in a certain craft who get together to try their best to create some control over the price, quality, and quantity of goods. Now, in the guilds, women were increasingly excluded. So there were certain jobs that would have been performed by women that were increasingly being transferred over to guilds, and women were increasingly being excluded from the guilds. And so Middle Age Europe became an increasingly patriarchal society. Now, sometimes these guilds and even states and towns would get together to try and create some sort of control over trade. And this occurred in particular in the North Sea right here with what's known as the Hanseatic League, which was an alliance of cities and guilds that promoted and protected trade. There was a lot of piracy back then in period 3. And so this Hanseatic League was designed to basically create that sort of centralized authority and control to ensure that trade was protected and it was facilitated. And so this is going to be really a precursor to some of the trade alliances that are going to form even in the 20th and 21st century with groups, for instance, like the European Union or NAFTA, these regional trade agreements. Something very similar occurred back in period 3 with the formation of the Hanseatic League. So as a result of watching this video, you should be able to answer these 2 big questions. First, what are the cultural continuities and changes in Western Europe during the Middle Ages? And second, how is order maintained in a feudal society? Thanks for watching.